So the MCU has just got done wrapping up its first foray into the animated world. What if? Back when Phase 4 was announced, this was definitely the project that stuck out to me the most. Personally, I've kind of felt like the MCU has become a bit stale and relied too much on comedic highs and lows and fan service. I think that the height of the MCU, the peak of the MCU, is Avengers Infinity War. I think that movie just encapsulates the best the MCU has to offer. I was quite disappointed by Endgame. I enjoyed the first half an hour and the last 45 minutes, but other than that, I found it very disappointing. So for me, going into Phase 4 and seeing the projects the MCU was coming out with, none of them particularly resonated with me. But What If stood out because it had the potential to be something really special. It was animated, you had people reprising their roles from the MCU, so there was that definite interconnection, and just the fact that it's What If and it's animated means that there's just a plethora of things you could do. And after seeing everything that was slated for Phase 4 come out, I probably still hold that same feeling. WandaVision was great, but loses a lot of its magic after that first watch. Falcon and Winter Soldier was very, very flat for me. I didn't really enjoy it that much. It was fine, but it just wasn't that amazing. Loki was really good, had a great start, an okay middle, and then a really strong finish. The introduction of He Who Remains was interesting, and seeing that character go forward is going to be great. Jonathan Majors is a true thespian, a great, great actor, and I can't wait to see what the MCU lets him do with that character. Black Widow was okay. What they did to Taskmaster was crap, but the film was okay. Shang-Chi was probably the biggest surprise out of Phase 4. It felt very fresh, it was very colourful, the action was great, a very heartfelt story, and I'm actually invested in that character, and which is interesting because previously I thought I would not care for him at all, but I'm actually quite invested in him going forward. So now I guess the question is, did What If live up to my expectations? And I'm going to give you a very wishy-washy answer and say yes and no. I think there were episodes that were fantastic and there were episodes that were lukewarm. I don't think any episode was bad. I don't think any of the series was terrible. But I just don't think it necessarily always hit those heights consistently. I think there were weeks when I was breathtaking and there were weeks where I just felt a bit meh. So let me go into a little preamble before I dissect the series. What If has been in the Marvel DNA for a long, long time, for decades. And it revolves around this idea of taking a pivotal moment or just taking a character, set of characters or a situation and then turning it left when it went right. So in the 616 continuity, something happened and it kept going this way. But with the What If scenario, it went the other way. And it's a one and done story where it shows the consequences of those situations. Sometimes it creates really, really great stories. Sometimes it's just, it's just there for the sake of it. It's there for writers to sort of flex their writing muscles and their creative muscles. And what was interesting for me about the animated version of What If was that they were taking a very, very multiversal approach. Like I said, What If is usually a one and done kind of thing. It's not really about creating a universe that lives simultaneously side by side the regular continuity. That kind of thing is much more of a DC thing. Elseworlds, multiverse, that's very much DC's lane. And so it was interesting for me to see Marvel take this approach to What If. And I kind of tip my hat to them for doing so, because for this to be the first time the MCU's dabbling in animation, and also to have that animation have such a strong connection to the future of the live action content that's coming, is quite ballsy. So I guess a good place to start will be the voice cast. Even though it's great that so many actors reprise their roles from the MCU for this series, it's quite obvious that a lot of them haven't had much voiceover experience, and I hope that's something that improves if this series continues. Like, I hope this isn't just a one series thing that doesn't happen again. I hope we get multiple series of What If. So that's something that's definitely not perfect, but can improve going forward. I think it's really good to have these actors back just because it cements that connection to the live action universe. There are some very obvious omissions that didn't reprise their roles. Tom Holland, Robert Downey Jr. I don't really know the circumstances behind that, but the people that they got to play those characters instead do very decent impressions of those actors anyway, so it doesn't feel like too much of a loss. The main voice we hear throughout the series is Jeffrey Wright as the Watcher. I like him a lot. I think he's a great actor. His voice has this very, very deep gravitas to it. I think he brings enough stoicism, but also adds a bit more emotion than we're used to with the Watcher. The Watcher is a character that can sometimes appear quite soulless, especially when you're reading him on a comic book page. But I think with Jeffrey Wright's interpretation of the character, you do get that sense of someone that is very world weary. You get the idea that this oath of never interfering actually has an emotional impact. So there's actually empathy and pain behind a lot of the dialogue. So the first episode is the Captain Carter episode. Captain Carter is interesting because she was first introduced in a mobile game and then sort of gained this sort of cult popularity from that point. This episode was fine. I think its issues are in the fact that it tries to consolidate the 2-hour story of Captain America the First Avenger into 30 minutes, and it literally follows the exact same beats. Peggy and Steve's will they won't they romance, the administration seeing the experiment as a failure because they only got one soldier. In the original, obviously it's much more about not believing that Steve by himself can have that much of an impact. In this, it's much more about sexism and misogyny, viewing Peggy as a woman as being lesser than. But yeah, it's just very, very similar. Even though it's different, it's probably too similar to the original. Like I said, it's not bad, it's just not amazing. And for me, I was kind of happy they started with this episode. It felt intentional they started with this episode because it's really just the tip of the iceberg of what the series has to offer. Next up, we have Star-Lord T'Challa, one of my favorite episodes. I thought this was great. It was really nice to hear Chadwick again. There was a lot of heart and humor in this episode. I think the MCU can be criticized for sometimes having too much humor or humor that doesn't hit, but I think it really did work in this episode. I liked what they did with Thanos, with Nebula. Seeing these new iterations was really, really interesting, and how T'Challa being in space influenced them. And I think that's one of the main takeaways I had, because I think in the comics T'Challa is this super intelligent, charismatic character, and we don't really get to see that a lot in the MCU, and we're not going to get to see it because obviously Chadwick has unfortunately passed. In his first introduction in Civil War, we saw how adept he was as a fighter. We got some great father-son stuff with him and T'Chaka, but after T'Chaka's murdered, he just becomes fueled by revenge, and as a result, we didn't get to see much of his personality come out in that movie. We only got to see him fight, really. And then in his own movie, he was kind of sidelined for a lot of the other characters, characters like Okoye, Nakia, Shuri, M'Baku, Claw to an extent, Killmonger. Just these characters seemed a lot more interesting than T'Challa in his own movie, which again was a bit sad because now that he's gone, we're not going to get to see more sides of T'Challa. But this episode really highlighted how charismatic he is, how intelligent he is, and it was just really heartwarming to also hear Chadwick's voice again. And a bit sad as well, knowing that we're not going to get to see him in another live-action movie. Next was the Whodunit episode with the Avengers being picked off one by one. I think this was another good episode. I was genuinely confused as to who was behind the murders, but when it was revealed, it made complete sense. I think there could have been a bit more explanation to the actual event that then fueled that person's intent, but it made sense to that character and it fit really well within this episode. The voice acting was strong and I liked the animation, and it was interesting to sort of see people in places that they weren't in the live action. So for example, seeing Mark Ruffalo in the events of The Incredible Hulk, because obviously Ed Norton was the Hulk in that movie. Also seeing Romolo as an active S.H.I.E.L.D. agent back then, because we were not introduced to that character until Winter Soldier. In the fourth episode, we're introduced to Supreme Strange. I thought it was a great episode. I think this was a lot of people's favorite episode. It was a great character study. It dealt with grief and loss in a very interesting and impactful way. Strong voice acting. The way it touched on extra-dimensional creatures was also very interesting. I think it also gave us a bit more of a time frame for the status and situation of our Doctor Strange, because in this, it's said out loud that he's the Sorcerer Supreme. In the actual MCU proper, the live action MCU, it's a bit up in the air if he's actually become the Sorcerer Supreme, but based off the time frame of this compared to the time frame of what we've got in the live action universe, I think it's safe to say that Doctor Strange is Sorcerer Supreme in the live action MCU. I also really appreciated how we got to see Stephen Strange for who he was, as a selfish person, as an insecure person, and the difference that losing part of yourself versus losing someone that means the world to you can shift your worldview, and how the different things it brings out of you, the different type of grief it brings out of you. Next up was Marvel Zombies, an episode that I was really, really looking forward to. Did it deliver? Yes. I personally thought it was good. I saw quite a few people didn't really appreciate it that much, but I thought it was a really good episode. I appreciate that we got an actual explanation for the zombie virus. I appreciated the characterization of Peter Parker in this episode. The person that was doing the voice for Peter was pretty good. It wasn't Tom Holland, but the person doing the impersonation of Tom Holland was pretty good. I love the dynamic between the survivors. It was this family, but also this very sort of hodgepodge ragtag team. Like, when are you ever going to see Happy Hogan and Okoye in the same team? Only in the zombie apocalypse. So I really liked how they sort of put these people together and how those dynamics played out. I really liked some of the revelations towards the end of the episode. There were some surprise appearances from both characters and actors that played those characters that was really, really cool. We had a really cool cliffhanger ending, which probably will be dealt with to its the furthest extent in season 2 of What If.
I appreciated the nods to the Marvel Zombies comic book. I also really appreciated the nods to things like Zombieland. Peter Parker has this info video of how to survive a zombie apocalypse, which is definitely taken from that franchise, which I thought was pretty funny and pretty cool. And all around, I really enjoyed this episode. I think it had a great climax, great character moments, and it was very enjoyable. Number 6 is the Killmonger episode. In Black Panther, we got a sample of how evil Killmonger is. In this episode, we got the full taste. And for me, it was interesting watching it because I remember a few months ago, I was having a conversation with an African-American woman on Clubhouse, and she was insinuating that there was an undertone of racism that meant people would sympathize with a character like Bucky, but a character like Killmonger is seen as irredeemable and had to die in Black Panther. And for me, I was in two minds because from what I'd seen, people were fucking with Killmonger. Like they were fucking with him heavy. They liked his ideas, they liked his characterization. Obviously, Michael G.B. Jordan is a heartthrob, so they were kind of all over Killmonger. I might even go as far as saying that in Black Panther, he was the most appreciated character coming away from that movie. I think people liked him the most. But yeah, my argument was just that Bucky was literally brainwashed, whereas Killmonger just had bad things happen to him, was traumatized, and then chose to take up an evil path. And this episode just vindicated that because he was a real evil bastard in this. He killed everyone he needed to kill, didn't care, had no remorse, set people up. And for me, I really liked how it fleshed out a lot of the things we heard in Black Panther. We'd heard a lot about his physical prowess, his military training, how good he was at espionage. And in this, we really got to see all of that. And as much as I love Black Panther, I think this episode really highlighted its flaws. I think the sequence in Seoul, Korea could have been taken out and been replaced with Killmonger infiltrating maybe neighboring nations, sowing a lot of anti-Wakanda propaganda, capturing Claw, taking him to Wakanda, revealing himself, revealing his birthright, fitting into the royal family, but then simultaneously also sowing seeds of discontent with T'Challa's reign. And that could have made for a much more interesting story that was completely focused in Africa. But, you know, I get it. You need to try and influence the Asian market to come and see the film, so it makes sense. Now we're at Party Thor. And, you know, I thought this episode was fine. On a level, I did enjoy it. It was fun. It was colourful. It was exuberant. I like that certain parts of the animation were very reminiscent of Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote from Looney Tunes. But I think overall, I'm not really a fan of this whole comedic Thor thing they're trying to do with the MCU. I know that Chris Hemsworth seems to excel a lot more in the realm of comedy, so they're pushing a very comedic version of Thor in the movies. But if we weren't getting that in the live action movies, then I would appreciate it here maybe. Thor's not a buffoon. He's never been a buffoon. He's never been an idiot. So this characterization of him being that, it's just, I don't get it. For me, it's not appealing. But the fight between him and Captain Marvel was good, and it does leave us with a very nice cliffhanger to go into the 8th and best episode of the series. Much like Game of Thrones, the penultimate episode of this series is its best. What If Ultron 1 is incredible. The voice acting, the cinematography, there are some shots in this that are truly beautiful. It made me want to see cosmic characters like the Living Tribunal and Eternity as soon as possible. I really love the way the Watcher was characterized in this. Seeing him be afraid was brilliant. I love how Jeffrey Wright played that off. I think the voice of Ultron is the same actor that voiced Red Skull in Infinity War. He does a really, really good job of this not quite James Spader, not quite Paul Bettany in-between voice. I think this episode really highlighted that Age of Ultron wasn't as good as it could have been. The characterization of Ultron in this eclipses anything that happened in the actual Age of Ultron movie. I wish they'd gone all out Age of Ultron in the movie and been as ballsy to do that in Phase 2, where you have Ultron win, take over the world, and then have a scenario where you then need to use time travel. Obviously, we didn't get that till Endgame, but I think it would have been really brave and we could have potentially got a really great story. I love that you get to see the real difference between Ultron and Thanos when both of them are respectively in possession of the Infinity Stones. So you have Thanos, who has this crazy idea about fair euthanasia, or fair genocide even, which is, you know, completely nuts, but you kind of, he says it and expresses it in a way where it's kind of like, okay, cool. If I was as crazy as you, I could see why you think that would be a good idea. But then with Ultron, it's much more this thing of where he believes he's a soulless machine, but really he's this creature seeking purpose. And he believes that he's found his purpose. And you can see how once he believes he's destroyed everything in the known universe, he's saddened and he wishes he could have continued. And then when he discovers there are other universes, even though he's calculating and cold, it's very much this thing as where I'm going to draw this out because I feel fulfilled within doing this. So it's much more about this selfish need to feel fulfilled from Ultron when he's doing what he's doing. This is kind of how I imagine a Brainiac movie to be, a movie where Brainiac is the antagonist. And DC needs to jump on that quickly, because this episode was chef's kiss. It was mwah. Final episode was a fitting conclusion. It wasn't as good as the episode previous. Some things I did like the animation in terms of a lot of the crackly energy sort of bursts and blasts reminded me of Jack Kirby's drawings. It seemed it had that Kirby-esque sort of look to it. I was kind of confused about the rules of the Infinity Stones, because in relatively recent Marvel Comics lore, specifically Jonathan Hickman's run on the Fantastic Four, it's explicitly stated that Infinity Stones are useless outside of the universe they originate from. That doesn't seem to be the case in this, because a stone is used in a universe that it didn't originate from to great effect. But that's fine. Things don't have to be exactly the same from comic to adaptation. It just would be nice if we got some explanation. I know, because it's easy to do exposition in comics because it's a written format. It just would be nice if we got some sort of explanation as to how things work in the live action / animated MCU. But the team chemistry in this episode was good. I liked Captain Carter. I liked Killmonger again in this episode, showing us why he's a real evil bastard. Doctor Strange was a real standout for this one as well. And yeah, it's a shame, because the Gamora character seemed interesting, but she was just introduced very boom, here, this is the new version of Gamora. And I think there was supposed to be another episode where Gamora and Tony are there on Sakaar, like in Thor Ragnarok, but with Tony and Gamora rather than Thor being there. So yeah, I don't know what happened to the episode. I'm guessing pandemic sort of stopped that from being finished in time. I think some of these episodes seem like they probably had chunks left out of them, so they were meant to be longer. But we've obviously been through a pandemic, and as a result, content's been cut down. But it's the lesser price to pay in the grand scheme of things. So overall, I think What If was a good series with great moments in it. I'm looking forward to seeing what the MCU does with their animated content, because I think it could be a great place to trial out things that they think are too cerebral or too silly in the MCU. So things like the Living Tribunal, things like Galactus and the Silver Surfer, things like the Squadron Supreme, whatever it might be. It's a perfect place to try it out. And also, I would really like something to challenge Warner Bruce's reign at the top of animation. I think they've become very complacent, and a lot of the content they're producing hasn't been great. To be fair, The Long Halloween Part 2 was fantastic, but their more recent attempts at animated movies haven't been that great. Obviously, they have so many shows that stand the test of time. Batman, Superman, Justice League Unlimited, and you can go back and watch those, and they're still just as great as they were back then. They've had more recent hits with things like Young Justice, but then even season 3 of Young Justice was not as well received as the first 2. And unfortunately, at the moment, they're quite stagnant. And, there have been times where Marvel have tried to sort of create animated content. Ultimate Avengers 1 and 2, Young Thor, there was an Iron Man movie, but none of them were that great. In the 90s, they had a few good series, X-Men, Silver Surfer. The Incredible Hulk first season was very strong as well, but they just became irrelevant after that time period. So I would really like to see Marvel take this opportunity to now create quality animated content that challenges the legacy that Warner Bros. And DC have had from the 90s. So yeah, let me know what you think of What If. Are you excited for season 2? Did season 1 disappoint you? I'm all ears. This is the Neeks and Freak Show, and we'll be back with a new episode real soon.